problem with hatred and love it does not and cannot see. Reading Jane Austen begins with a cut, turns one back into a Freudian. First a dusting of snow, then a light rain, no minimal way to hide our disappointments. From ingrained tracks and tendencies, pattern, recognition, and wind-blown grass.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to William Blake Live. We had a skip week last week, but we're back, and I am here with DJ Lee, my colleague at Washington State University, who's done a lot of work on William Blake. And you also did a lot of work on, it's out of print now, but on the slave trade and like the history of that in Romantic studies.
Sure? This one is out of print?
Is it out of print? Oh, I thought you said it was out of print. Maybe it's not.
A different one is out of print. This one was Alan Richardson and I reprinted the early Black British writers. So
right, yeah,
we wrote little introductions. It's out of print, but you can get it for like $2 on used books.
That's really important when I was like trying to do my global romanticism class. So it was great. And then more recently, your most recent book is Remote: Finding Home in the Bitter Roots. This is a project you've been doing for 15 years, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about it before we get back into the Blake stuff.
Well, it's it's a braided hybrid memoir that uses my on-the-ground journey through this huge wilderness area. It's 5 million acres, the size of Kentucky, roadless land, where I discovered that my family had this history that I didn't know about. And it was a 15-year journey. So and I'll be talking about this kind of writing a little bit too when I present today, but it's a kind of writing that uses personal experience, this sort of through timeline, where I'm hiking and uncovering stuff, and then it goes back into history and memory. So it weaves different timelines.
Cool. And for some reason, I'm remembering that you were a big fan of Sebald, right? Like, is that something that is his work? Does his work sort of?
Yeah, he was like my biggest influence. Yeah. Sebald. I adore him. I've read everything he's written, and I'm like always reading one of his books or rereading them. Yeah.
Oh.
So, yeah.
All right. Well, let's just start and tell me a little bit about why you started reading William Blake and how he became important to your work.
Okay, Blake is the romantic poet that I identify most with, and I discovered him as a 18-year-old undergraduate. I was drawn like immediately to his hybridity, to his visions, his sort of mental illness, or whatever you want to call it. And I love his experiments with form, his revolutionary ideas. I consider myself sort of an artist too. I'm a hand paper maker, and I've done printmaking. And so I'm just really drawn to him because of his use of different forms and his kind of maker mentality. When I was a graduate student, I was at the University of Arizona, and I happened to go to a dinner where Henry Louis Gates was the speaker, and he came and he sat right next to me. I was like 25 years old, and I was like, it was awesome. It was like an awesome moment. He had just published The Signifying Monkey, and I was trying to figure out what to do for my dissertation. So I had been interested in writing about slavery and the slave trade, because at that point, in what year would that have been? I don't know, 1990 or something. There had not been very much written about the slave trade and Romanticism. There'd been like maybe one book and then a few articles. And I said, even back then, I said, obviously I'm not an African American or person of color, but can I do this? And he said, absolutely. These things need to be done. And so the first, this was my dissertation, and it became a book at some point. I can't remember. But the very first chapter I wrote for the book was the Blake and Stedman. And Blake's, I think I looked at Visions of the Daughters of Albion and some of the images of slaves and slavery, and but the main focus of this chapter was monkeys, and I used Henry Louis Gates signifying monkey, which at the time was brand new, to kind of read Blake's obsession with, not obsession, but monkeys appear enough times in his, here's an illustration he did for John Gay, enough times in his work, and especially his work on Stedman, that I was able to do a chapter on that for my dissertation and the book. When I first started teaching, I got a job at Washington State where Roger is, and then I taught a bunch of classes on Blake and printmaking, and I'll just show you here. Yeah, so this is just an article from 2010 of one of the classes that I did, and the students actually made their own plates. It was half of it was in the printmaking studio, and then I make my own plates. So this is I think this is the Jerusalem lily, and then this is a quote from Thel. Is it Thel? Yeah, I can't even remember.
I think so.
Anyway, and then I started working on single mothers and foundling children, and I wrote, this was, later, I wrote this essay, Blake and Foundling in the Foundling Hospital. Let's see, where did it go?
Yeah. That's one of my favorite things you've written that I've read.
Yeah. And then I used his plates. I used some of the plates from the Foundling Hospital with his lost and found children from the Songs of Innocence. And I was going to do an actual book on Hogarth and Blake and in the Foundling Hospital. And I actually had an offer from University Press to do that book. And then I just switched from writing academic and scholarly prose to personal essays and personal books. And I started that article came out in 2007. In 2008, I started going to creative writing workshops in the summers. I realized that just because I'd written all these academic books, I didn't actually know how to write creatively, effectively. There's a whole art to it that it seems simple, but there's all these little nuances and tricks and, things that will mark you as an amateur if they're there. And I didn't know what those were. So I was just really, I had this insatiable drive to just be able to write about my own experience. So that, I think that was one of the things that frustrated me about academic prose after a while, was that my own personal experience could not be used as evidence in my writing.
What was interesting, and I'm speaking from the perspective of someone who knows nothing about creative writing, so I'm just going to say that as a check up front. But it's interesting that, going back to the Foundling hospital piece, how many parallels in terms of style there is between that piece and your creative work. There is this kind of like this personal narrative kind of flow through the piece that was really it's really refreshing when you read it. And so is there a way that work kind of
I was getting to the point where I couldn't hold back. I was, because you guys all know you're doing this amazing research. You're in these archives, you're visiting these landscapes, you're having these visceral, really intimate experiences and aha moments. And then they have to be, they have to be funneled into a kind of prose that doesn't allow you to explore them in any depth. And that's okay, but I couldn't. I was breaking out of that already. You're right at that point. So I tried writing these. I tried writing personal stuff, and then yay, thank you. Yes, if you have comments, while I'm talking, I'd love to or questions, like please.
I didn't mean to interrupt, but I really relate to your observation about archives, because I work in archives and have for 20 years, and never say all that you wanted out that you experienced in the moment. It never ever goes that way. So I agree. I was just
and art. I mean, there's so many books where the character goes into the archives. Everybody loves that stuff. I mean, it's secrets. It's like, what am I going to find? It's old documents. It's memory. It's history. It's fragments. It's it's just so rich as a setting and as a scene, and what's going on in your head as you're there. But none of that can really go into the scholarly pieces, at least in the tradition I was trained in. I have to say I'm not that up on scholarship these days. Anyway, just because I couldn't write in a personal narrative way that was very effective, I actually went back and got my MFA. I'd been a full professor, and I was just like, I'm turning 50, and this is my birthday present to myself. And at the end of your MFA, you have to give a big lecture to the student body. So my lecture was called A Personal Blake. So I think it's significant that my final project for my MFA was weaving in my personal experience and learning to write about Blake in a personal way. So
that's really fascinating, because I've often noted, I mean, in my own research, and in a totally different way, I think, the way that people, and I think as we've gone through this series, we've seen this with different scholars in their own particular unique way, how there is this kind of odd personal connection that people have with Blake. And I think that from my own experience, like it's really a kind of weird thing that I don't quite know how to articulate, but it's very fascinating that you sort of like caught on to that, and like in terms of your own sort of the importance that you place on personal narrative and your own, that then becomes a lens for you to return to Blake is interesting.
You're looking for those organic moments that happen as you're traveling through the research or whatever. And then those are the moments that you use to turn kind of into metaphor. And I don't know, I was thinking of maybe reading like the first couple paragraphs to this to show you guys what I mean. Is that okay? Do people do that in here?
Yeah, do it.
Okay. I'll actually share the screen again so you guys can actually see the language. In the winter of 2000, I heard about the biggest retrospective ever of William Blake's work was to be held at the Tate, London. Okay, right there, that sentence is a little garbled. But anyway, set to open in February, it would bring together collections all over England, Australia, and the US. Blake's Death Mask, an 18th century printing press, and the delicate tempera paintings like The Ghost of the Flea. I lived in Washington State and I was broke. So when I found myself in London, sitting in the rain on the steps of the Tate, the morning the exhibit opened, having charged the trip on my visa, I knew I had come face to face with my Blake obsession. The guard unlocked the doors and I headed straight for the Songs of Innocence and Experience. The illustrated poems, experts call them plates since they are images and words intertwined and printed together, were mounted as single pages on a display running through in the center of a hollow room. The plates are small. Most are only 5 inches tall, and I had wanted to be alone with them without crowds of people. Instead, I ended up following a tall, gangly man who stood for 10 minutes at a time, gnarled face an inch from each image. I was irritated by his presence until I realized that he was almost blind. And I'll stop there. But so the piece, uses this juxtaposition between blindness and vision, and it moves, through the exhibit, me following this guy who's super interesting. He's just like this with each plate and just so viscerally physical. And then it moves back to memory, some of my childhood memories, my early memories connecting with Blake, and then back into history. And then kind of weaves back together, all in the theme of seeing and not seeing.
What is like, so is there something about this theme of seeing and not seeing that is particularly important for you and for your own journey here?
I actually think that theme is a little bit obvious and cliche. So I never did try to get this published. I think it needs more work. And that's why in 2018, I went back to London and did this other research project that I thought I could maybe intertwine the two together, that would maybe have more insight and give me greater insight into my own Blake obsession. So.
Okay. Well, do you want to talk a bit about that trip?
Yeah. And if you guys have any questions or comments, please break in, because I know what it's like to be on Zoom. It can be like really flat, Well, first of all, do you guys have any questions or comments before I show you a little bit about my Blake House piece that I'm trying to put together?
Okay.
Oh, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Interested in that switch from really kind of a literary scholar, especially Blake, to kind of a creative writer, because of course there's all that, particularly in Jerusalem, Blake is kind of very effusive about sort of, the true Christian is the artist, and I just wonder whether you can do creative work that sort of separate from the ideas that you generated from literary criticism, or are they kind of there in shaping the creative work you do?
I think they are. Yeah, I think they're definitely there in shaping the creative. I mean, I think of, probably the person who does that best right now is Rob McFarland, where he weaves the personal, the on the ground journey with a lot of scholarship. But I'm not interested in using that voice. I'm much more interested in getting like as intimate as possible. And I think that the creative voice is really the only one that can get that intimate and looking at questions of self-examination, but through that, you're allowing people to have insights into their own experience. One of my teachers in my MFA school was a writer named Philip Lopate. He's one of the probably one of the best known personal essayists in the US. And his contention is that personal essayists or creative writers, because there's all this kind of shade is being thrown on like memoirists and personal essayists, that they get too personal. And he's like, no, they don't get personal enough. Like, you have to be extremely vulnerable and looking at all the flaws in yourself, and you have to be like really raw and I don't know, that's just a place that I love to go to, and I think that's a place Blake went to a lot.
Cool. I had flashes of, for whatever reason, when David was talking about this question of intertwining the scholarly and the personal. I had flashes of Sebald, but then also of Walter Benjamin, right? Like this question of like, and it seemed like Benjamin and Sebald for some reason are like, maybe Sebald was more creative than scholarly, and maybe slightly if there's like a spectrum, and maybe Benjamin is sort of slightly more scholarly than creative. But it seems like there are these like figures who are constantly engaging with, you know, these fragments of history that as they weave in and out of memory, which is, so that was just the thought I had. But
I would totally agree with that. Yeah, with that assessment of Sebald and Benjamin. I think, I mean, Sebald has given some, you know, he gave some interviews before he died, and he did say that one reason he took up that form of whatever you want to call it, biography, memory, memoir, he calls them novels, you know, his four major books, was that, you know, he was a literary scholar of comparative literature at East Anglica, and he was like, he was tired of having to footnote every, you know, he really just couldn't stay in that scholarly discourse where everything had to be footnoted, you know, so many times, and all of, he wanted to play with what he knew about history in a more, you know, amorphous way. And, you know, the way he does it is he has these characters, you know, reporting to the narrator. And he said he uses that technique because then it frees him as the narrator from being accurate about everything. Although his history is very accurate, even though he picks up on the weirdest things, you know, strange. Do you guys all know Sebald's work? No? Yeah? Okay.
Yes.
Yay!
I work on German stuff a bit, so I've read pretty much everything.
What do you think, Ian, of his work?
I think he's brilliant, brilliant. I think some of them are not really novels. I forget if he calls like The Emigrants and stuff, but yeah, he's fabulous.
Are you in that Sebald movie?
Me?
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
I unfortunately have to leave in a minute for another Zoom seminar, alas.
oh,
But
so
I'll
much Zoom, Ian.
of this.
So much Zoom. So much Zoom.
Yeah. Well, it was great to meet you.
Yeah, before I go, T.J. Clark has there's an old. I was just trying to find a reference. He gave a talk at Yale a few years ago on Blake and Hazlitt. And he did it at a little Hazlitt thing also that I organized at the Tate years ago. It wasn't very well publicized. It was kind of private event, but he's written about Blake, and he has an essay in a book about to come out that's on Blake and Hazlitt, and he writes about the ghost of the flea that you.
And who is this again?
T.J. Clark.
Oh, P.J. Clark. Okay.
Yeah, he's great. He gave a talk. I think that must have been the talk he gave at the Berkeley Nasser.
Yeah, that was a longer version. Yeah, revamped version that he gave.
Amazing. It was like one of those experiences, those talks you go to, and you're like, I feel like a better person after going to that talk. You know, like it's just so fulfilling in so many ways.
He did an LRB review of the Blake Ashmolean show, 2015. You can read too, but yeah, he's amazing.
Cool.
But unfortunately, I have to go to a thing at 2:30 now, so maybe see you later.
Good to see you.
Thanks. Bye.
Glad it worked. I'm glad you got it.
Yeah, thanks for getting me in, Roger.
Yeah.
Can I add that I met Sebald when he was still teaching at UEA? I think that was the year he was writing, or rather translating his own work, The Emigrants, because he wrote it in German. And I remember him saying, I mean, I was lucky to be on the MA in comparative literature, and he did one of the modules on it. And he was using his own text, which hadn't been published yet. And it was amazing. And he was very humble about it. And he said, knowing what a celebrity he has become and is still one of the best German writers, he said he was under a lot of pressure because everyone around him was writing creatively. And I've always wondered if the two blurred into one, actually, that there wasn't a switch. But it just seemed to be the same thing. This is just a response. Yeah. I'm not sure if that was the case, but it was very special for me.
That is so. I'm just.
It was before he became famous. So
made my day. I mean, it's so great. Yeah, I mean, I think that obviously his knowledge, just his knowledge of literature and history is just, unstoppable in those books. And I just love that he adopted this persona that allowed him to blend the two. And it is a memoir voice. It's a voice, a lot of like the immigrants, he's taking a trip. He goes to visit his family in the US, but then they take him back, to other times. So these internal and external journeys. And then the Rings of Saturn, of course, is that walk in Suffolk, and then Austerlitz is the meetings that the narrator keeps having with Austerlitz. So yeah, I feel like he just used a very simple trope, which is just walking through a landscape or taking a little journey, which is, I'm really drawn to that form too. Here's the journey, and then what all of the associations that can pour into that one little. I mean, I do want to say that another thing about Sebald that I love is his emphasis on coincidence and synchronicity. And he talks about that a little bit in a couple of his interviews, but if you look at the plot points of his books, and I actually use that too, I took that from him, but I mean, a lot of authors do that, but it's that point when things happen that are unexpected, and like some mystical force has brought these two things together for you. And that's the moment that you need to write about, that sort of intensity that happens when you're like, oh, that's so weird that happened at the same time this happened, and now I understand this thing that I've been trying to figure out. And those are the moments that he articulates. And I love that.
I'm oddly writing about that, a similar thing.
No, it's not odd. It's meant to be
synchronicity, but through like comic books and Carl Barks right now. But Carl Barks does that a lot in his Donald Duck comics, and it's often sometimes articulated in a way that is like a gag, or it's like funny. But there is something about I don't know, like I say this in the sense of like, it's really fascinating to think about your career, Debbie, as a kind of, in this sort of broader sense, a kind of I don't know if it's a critique or if it's a comment, or like in terms of like what the role of a literary scholar is today. Like, what are we asking literary scholars? What kind of knowledge do they have, and what do they communicate? What do we value from them, right? Mm-hmm. Do we value somebody who can give us, more information about a particular part of Blake's biography, or do we value this other, and I don't think it's an either or necessarily, but like, or do we value this other sort of like unique perspective that brings us to these moments of kind of revelation based on these kind of synchronicities, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think there's room for both, I do think there's room for both. And what do you guys think? No response.
Yeah, room for both, I think, surely.
Yeah.
I mean, there's often like institutional kind of pressures to produce certain kinds of research. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I do think there's a sort of, perhaps a problem that's harder to have the coincidental kind of research, which can often be quite kind of fruitful and productive. Mm-hmm. But there's all sorts of other pressures as well, of course. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But yeah, and the historical facts are often quite, sort of revelations in themselves.
Yeah.
Not always. Sometimes they just sort of reinforce what we already know. But facts could, so someone were to find next week that kind of, I don't know, Blake had invested in a kind of slave trading company. Can't imagine it myself, but that kind of enormously transformative effect on how you'd interpret the work, I think.
Yeah, and I think ultimately it transforms then the person, the scholar who's been invested in it, and those that really intimate, like, oh my God, like, now who am I if Blake, this person I've spent all this time, is not what I thought. I mean, those kinds of soul searching questions, but you can't really get at that in the traditional academic discourse that I was trained in. You can't get at those moments unless you can also have a very personal voice in your piece.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me quite a bit of, like, I mean, this is kind of obvious, but like Benjamin's stuff about the constellation and the moment of danger. Like, he's sort of saying, like, history doesn't just exist as this like enumeration of dates, right? It's actually these moments in which something opens up for us and we realize that this is important, right? So like, and I think on the one hand, it's really fascinating to think about this in terms of like institutional requirements. Like, people want to hire a 19th century scholar, but like understanding like what they look for, I think, is really fascinating, because like I was hired as a DH person, and I just happened to be able to like articulate my job in that way. But like, if we think about this in terms of like, I don't know, this question of like what it is we want from history, I think it's just interesting. I don't know. My comment kind of fell apart.
Always change.
But I think it works too, because I think people are looking for people to articulate what's happening now. And so like, scholarship like, the slave trade right now suddenly becomes very important, right?
Have been asked. I mean, these books are pretty old. This book is, I don't even know what year it is. It's like 2002, and people are like asking me now to write these essays, like, and I thought that book was just dead, but yeah, so that's interesting. And again, I'm just like, I'm not the person, because I'm not a person of color, and I still feel a little uncomfortable with that, but.
It's like the same moment, but a different moment too, right? Like, it's interesting too. Like, it's like, in as much as like, back in the 90s, Henry Louis Gates saying to you like, yeah, go ahead and write it. Yeah. The question would become like, if that moment happened now,
I know
how the conversation would have gone.
Yeah, exactly. So, Richard, did you have a comment?
Just the way that I retired about 3 years ago, so I've been having my research options have been opened.
Yeah.
In many ways, because I'm not, nobody's looking over my shoulder about this stuff. So I've been able to explore some, I did all this stuff with Blake and with Romanticism and Bob Dylan, but I started working with this crackpot idea about if Sherlock Holmes had read Blake. He'd been given a copy of the Yates Ellis edition.
Yeah.
And what would he see in it? And it led me down this weird path, because he would look at the times Blake got arrested. So I started doing some research on that. And that was fascinating, because it turns out Blake may actually have been railroaded in Felpham. Because I ran across an article that went through and looked at what exactly the law was that he should have been tried for. And none of those people should have been on the bench.
Yeah.
The proceedings were illegal. And then his earlier arrest with, I think it was Stoddard and the gang, they were out drawing pictures of great houses. And I don't know, I'd always heard about, it was just crazy. They were just out drawing pictures. The house that they were arrested drawing pictures in front of is directly across the river from this huge naval installation. And so they're across from this military base drawing sketches.
Yeah, so I know when you actually go to these places, and spend time, you just have these amazing insights. Yeah.
Yeah, but then this was just written up in an article about because there had been a print that had been uncovered of I think maybe that Stoddard had done of what he was drawing at the time, and so they were actually able to identify the place on the river where they were.
Neat, yeah.
But then what do you do with this? I mean, I
mean, you write your sci-fi story.
I had this whole story in mind about what
Yeah.
And this whole conspiracy continuing on.
Yeah. Well, do it. I mean, now's the time. Seize the moment. You're retired. Do it.
But you look for other ways to handle your research and other things to do with it.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
It reminds me a little bit of that. Really, one of my favorite Blake pieces of Blake research of all time, which is, now that I'm thinking about it in this context, is really weird. Mm-hmm. Is like Blake's death, the one that Viscomi does with the medical doctor, where they try to diagnose what disease he had. Yeah. And I was like, why are scholars doing that? It's the context of this is just so weird and eccentric to me, but I just remember reading it and being fascinated by how they were reconstructing from his diaries.
Oh yeah.
He was talking about having this, so he must have had this kind of symptom and it must have been this thing. And that thing, that's fascinating to me. So,
well, even, I mean, I'm just thinking of Ray Carver has that story told from the butler the butler of that was brought food to Chekhov when he died. And so it uses some of that same literary sleuthing, but turns it into a short story, but writes from the perspective. But you can do that in fiction, right? So people are interested in that. I mean, I'm interested in it, right? So
yeah.
But here, I'll show you a little bit in talking about coincidences, just because let's see. I'm just going to show you a little bit of my process. So these are the notes that I took while I was in London. I've obviously cleaned them up. So I kind of start out with this question. I had to see his houses, the poet's houses, because why? There was nothing holding him to the ground. He was a poet who demanded the physical because he was so ephemeral, spiritual, but why the houses? I wanted to see every single house he'd lived in London, but I just, I wasn't quite sure why. So I was just going on a hunch. And then, you have to be really attentive to the weather, to what's going on in the street. And then you use those moments to maybe go back in memory. A lot of the details, like when I was in the tube, Holborn, Covent Garden, Leicester Square, flowed by. I got off at Piccadilly Circus, 2 long escalators. So a lot of descriptive writing also goes into it as you're moving through the landscape. And then just from my own later research, I mapped out on my phone every place that I walked and rode on the train. And I had originally thought that I would just go visit the houses, visit each site, and just try to remember what I knew from my scholarship, just try to remember what London looked like then, and that I would actually be transported back in time. But actually what happened was that each house that I went to, the house itself was not just this relic of Blake's place where he created these amazing works and had these visions, but it was this living space that was in process. And so I started taking notes like right here. I heard 2 women pass by and laugh. They were walking quickly. I think they saw me taking photos. Oh, the great William Blake lived here. Ha 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 ha. Like it was a dodgy part of town or something. And so I started to take notes on that. I was mostly looking at the plaques, one on each side of a building called the William, and the next door neighbor, the Masala Zone, and Valerie's Patisserie. I was suddenly hungry and I wanted to go into the patisserie, but it was closed. Yeah. And then so again, that's kind of like that coincidence. just going there, putting yourself in the space and seeing what's going to occur and what moment is going to give you a sort of revelation. The one that I want to show you just very briefly, I did go to Felpham, and I had some really great revelations about the work that he made in Felpham just by walking the beach for a few days. I mean, the colors and it's just amazing. This is a picture I took out my window, which looks very much like that eye from the Visions of the Daughters of Albion. I went to the Savoy. He had lived right where the Savoy Hotel is now, but he actually lived down this alley. So I went down this alley by myself at night, and there were these hotel workers, and I had some encounters with them. But this one was the one that was the most meaningful to me. I know he has a new grave site now, but this was in 2018. So this is his grave, the old grave site. And another thing that I was really loving is just like a lot of times these spaces are, they're not these sacred spaces. There's litter right next door, but there's also these beautiful things like this lovely wheelbarrow that's just filled with plants. Anyway, so it was a really rainy, cold day and no one else was there. And I spent about 3 hours there. I was freezing cold, but see this guy right here, this person, I started to notice that I thought it was an older woman. And I thought she was trying to steal this bike because there were some homeless people in the area. And so I decided to walk over there. I felt like, okay, this is going to be a Blakeian moment. So I walk over there, and it's like a 18-year-old kid, and he's obviously strung out on drugs, and he's shaking. I don't know if he was trying to steal the bike or not, but I sat down and I had a long conversation with him about Blake, and it was wonderful. And that was a moment that in writing this piece, that this will be kind of a moment that will go in and out of the story, because he was a Blakeian figure himself, and he happened to be right by the grave, and we walked back over to the grave together, and he actually knew Keats. He was very well acquainted with Keats's poetry. He was quoting Keats and I was quoting Blake, and at the end I gave him like all the money I had in my wallet. I mean, who knows what he spent it on, but I was just like, it was just this really wonderful moment. So that's the kind of thing that you just hope happens, but you can't count on it.
This is really interesting. It's reminding me also a little bit of like Ian Sinclair's work, in terms of like he does a lot of, they're not novels, they're just he has one novel, but he has a lot of nonfiction too, where it's all about a walk, and he's tracing different things on the walk. And so one of my favorites of his is actually Edge of the Horizon, which is about John Clare. And apparently, John Clare was put into asylum at one point, and then he escaped, and he had this he thought that his wife was alive, if I'm remembering this correctly, but she wasn't. And there's this walk back from Essex that he takes in this kind of hallucination that Ian Sinclair reconstructs, and is very attentive to these historical confluences or synchronicities, right? And so one of the things he mentions there, apparently Tennyson and Clare were at the same asylum at the same moment at one point.
Wow.
And that kind of writing is really fascinating to me. This question of like, what is it when we say like, oh, I feel the synchronicity, like what's wrapped up in that feeling of, not just like this synchronicity, this coincidence, is it a coincidence, is it meaningful, but also like, what is it that leads to that experience of like, there are these historical moments crossing kind of thing, right? Like,
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Well, the Japanese, I guess, I've been told, have a saying called "No coincidence, no story." Yeah.
I just like to open it up to Q&A if you all want to.
Besides the fact that we want you to write a book about Holmes and Blake, Richard.
Yeah, we want you to.
Yes, I would love questions or insights. I'm just really appreciative, Roger, because I haven't, I've been busy with other things, and this is something I've always been meaning to get back to, and it forced me to go back to my notes and my photos and stuff.
So when were you at the cottage?
In 2018, I asked them to let me in, but they didn't want to. So I
visited it years ago when Heather was still living there.
Oh, okay. No, it was locked up. I had to it was fun, to sneak around, and because then I have a story.
Yeah. I mean, do you happen to know what the status of the house is these days?
There's a whole pamphlet on that. I showed you one photo. The thatching is falling off. So some of it was on the ground, so I got to pick up a few little.
Mm-hmm. Did you go to the Fox?
I did. Yes. I walked the whole place where he was arrested. I spent like a whole afternoon there. And again, just like absorbing the ambiance and taking notes and.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was cool.
Yeah.
It was interesting when I stayed in Felpham. I was there for 2 days, and the woman at the guest house was like, she obviously, she had maybe a high school education, but she'd heard of Blake. They'd gone there. She thought they had gone there to that house when she was in like 8th grade. She had zero interest. That's weird. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you feel like this is going to end up as like an essay, as like a book, as like how do you see this
I see it definitely as an essay. I mean, it's weird because I have like 4 or 5 personal essays out that 3 of them deal with Coleridge, 1 of them deals with Wordsworth, and I'm just one of them, Mary Shelley. And even though I think I'm writing about whatever, the Arctic or spiral jetty in Utah or whatever, I spent so many years as a scholar of Romanticism that the poets always work themselves in some way. Actually, I think there's about 7 of them that deal with the poets in some way. Or the novelists, yeah.
I mean, do you think that type of writing might be a way to make literary critical ideas more open to other people? Because there's definitely a kind of closed language at play in academia, whereas the memoir, with its very nature, it's direct, it's kind of intimate. Mm-hmm. It's easier, I think, probably for people to connect with it. I mean, the one form of literary criticism that does tend to sell copies of books is biography, and
exactly, yeah.
The sort of focus on the sort of intimate relation.
I do, and I think there's this, with the internet, there's just so many more venues to publish this kind of stuff. I mean, Ian mentioned LARB. I've written for them 3 or 4 times. That they're very open to that kind of literary criticism through first person. And there's just a lot of venues now to do that. Some really good ones too. I also have to say that it makes the personal essay, it elevates it too, because, the stuff that as scholars that we work with, it's complicated and interesting, and it goes deep, and it's like original. And so I don't know, maybe I don't really want this on, recorded, but I'll say it anyway. I mean, a lot of times when I was doing my MFA, I love the emphasis on style and on how to weave these things together. But one of the things that kept occurring to me is, these ideas that you guys have are, lots of people have said this. And so, but as scholars, we're trained, you know, like to take that, whatever the idea is, to take it further, to take it deeper, to make it more intense. And I think that just, it gives so much more depth and meaning to the memoir or the personal narrative. So I think the marriage of the two is like the marriage of heaven and hell. It's a beautiful thing.
Anyone else have a question?
David, where are you from?
Sorry, where am I now?
Yeah, where are you now?
I'm in Newcastle now,
Okay.
the northeast of England. We're not far from the border with Scotland. I work in London,
Oh, wow.
but I'm not traveling at the moment.
Right, yeah. Where are you, Sybil?
I'm in Lincoln, so that's East Midlands, and like David, I'm not traveling anywhere.
Yeah,
I'm German, so I'm not going home this summer, I think. So.
Wow, yeah. And Amanda, are you still there?
Yeah, hi. I actually have to leave in a minute for a meeting at 3, but yeah, I'm in Queens, New York.
Okay.
Yeah, it's almost about to rain. It's a quiet day today.
Oh.
Thanks for having me.
Thank
It's like perfect Washington weather, actually. It's kind of chill. Take care. Have a good day. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Sorry, where are you at the moment?
I'm actually in Idaho. I'm just saying, Roger and I don't live too far apart.
I was wondering whether Roger was just around that corner behind you, actually.
Yeah, no, I know. I think you're about a mile from where I am now.
That's probably about a mile.
Yeah, but we've all just been staying in too.
Yeah. I haven't seen anyone in months, like at all. I mean, you know. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much, Debbie. This was really awesome. And next week we are featuring Mark Lucier. So.
Oh, I love Mark. I gotta come.
Yeah. So take care. And
you know what he's talking about?
I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. I think it's Jerusalem again.
Oh, darn.
I think, yeah. Like we just have a lot of Jerusalem, but yeah, it is pretty long. So, all right. Well, have a great week, y'all.
Thanks, Roger.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.
This is the problem with hatred and love. It does not and cannot see. Reading Jane Austen begins with a cut, turns one back into a Freudian. First a dusting of snow, then a light rain. No minimal way to hide our disappointments. From ingrained tracks and tendencies, pattern, recognition,